The rapid outbreak of COVID-19 caused school closures in the United States from March 18th to the remainder of the 2019-2020 school year, with the exception of Montana and Wyoming, who chose to reopen for the last few weeks of school. Because of the newness of the situation and all of the unknowns surrounding the virus, teachers, students, and parents were left to create their own means of finishing out the school year, along with minimal guidance from local administration. As local systems, as well as those at the state and federal level, looking to the coming 2020-2021 school year, decisions regarding how to educate students were necessary. Considerations had to be given to what was safe and healthy for teachers and students, but it was also necessary to consider what model would provide effective instruction and learning. For March 2020 through the beginning of the 2020-2021 school year, local, state, and federal leaders worked to create plans for offering traditional, hybrid, or remote learning. 9 states received state orders mandating how and when schools would reopen in the 2020-2021 school year, while the other 41 states left the decision to each district regarding how and when reopening would occur. The Georgia Department of Education, along with the Georgia Department of Health, released a set of guidelines on June 1st, 2020 to help with the reopening of schools for the 2020-2021 school year. A revision of the guidelines were re-released on July 13th. Since the guidelines were not mandatory, each school district in Georgia was given the authority to decide when to return to traditional learning. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, requires that students with disabilities be provided a free and appropriate public education and development of an IEP in order to address student needs. In March 2020, the United States Department of Education released a supplemental fact sheet in order to address serving students with disabilities during COVID-19. Due to the unexpected nature of the pandemic, schools did not already have guidelines or provisions to address extended closures of school longer than 10 consecutive days. Services for students with disabilities follow the schedule of the general population of elementary and secondary students, and that if the general population is receiving education services, students with disabilities will also receive services. If the general population of elementary and secondary students are not receiving educational services, it is not required to provide services to students with disabilities. A free and appropriate education can be provided virtually, online, or telephonically. In order to address specifics with implementation of IDEA, the Georgia Department of Education released a guide in July 2020 on Restart and IDEA. The guide answers commonly asked questions regarding serving students with disabilities. Based on the guidelines for returning to traditional school, districts were able to prioritize groups of students to return to school. These groups of students could be based on age or students with IEPs or other support teams. They were not able to prioritize groups of students based on race or gender. To avoid amending the IEPs of every student who would be learning remotely, case managers were allowed to develop distance learning plans for each student. These are temporary provisions of special education services. One concern of school administrators and district leaders was whether they would be able to provide a comparable education to students, and especially to students with disabilities. Federal, state, and local levels of government were all involved in some form or fashion with creating and/or implementing guidelines to educate students through the COVID pandemic. Initially, it was the federal government which addressed education during COVID-19. The federally developed documents gave state and local authorities a guide for how and when they must provide instruction, including when to consider use of online or virtual instruction and other curriculum-based instructional activities. The state and local governments were primarily responsible for taking the federal documents and using them to create and implement specific and more detailed plans for how the upcoming school year would operate and what types of learning would be offered. Most states' guidelines contain guidance on reopening based on the level of risk of COVID within each community. Reopening trends could be seen among regions, race, and political affiliations. While most decision-making was granted to local schools and districts for reopening plans, there was no shortage of peer pressure from federal and state government officials. With the 2020 presidential election looming during the COVID pandemic, federal leaders used school reopenings as part of their platform. When planning and implementing how to educate students during a global pandemic, the U.S. Department of Education reminded schools of their obligation to special education services, whether learning virtually or in person. Schools that were quickest to open were in the South and Midwest regions, with just under 40% of 8th grade students enrolled in full-time in-person learning in January. The West and Northeast regions of the country had only approximately 10% of 8th grade students utilizing in-person learning full-time. Students in rural areas were found to be more likely to attend in-person learning compared to those students in cities. When analyzing 4th grade students, NBC News reports that there are striking differences based on students' race, with approximately half of white students participating in full in-person learning, while almost 60% of Black and Hispanic learners were participating entirely virtually. Among Asian students, only 15% were learning in person, while approximately 68% were participating in virtual learning. Only 42% of students with disabilities and 34% of English language learners were attending full-time in-person learning, with only 40% of schools reporting that they were giving up priority of in-person learning to students with disabilities. Punctuated equilibrium theory explains the observation of policy change as being stasis for long periods of time with only minor changes and then having times of dramatic or rapid change. As with the sudden, unexpected COVID-19 pandemic, a critical event occurred that demanded a radical change in many policies, including educational policies. With the onset of school closures for periods of time longer than 10 days, coupled with the unknown of the future of the virus, it was imperative for changes to be made in order to allow teaching and learning to continue through the pandemic. Punctuated equilibrium encompasses two concepts that explain how its systems are strengthened and weakened: policy images and policy venues. Policy images refer to the way in which the media and public view the policy, whether positive or negative. Negative policy images tend to get more attention than positive. Policy images were created by various communities as COVID continued to spread and threaten the reopening of schools for the 2020-2021 school year. Without the pandemic and the need for policy changes regarding educating students virtually, this type of change would not have likely happened, or it would not have happened anytime in the immediate future. Teachers' unions make up one community who were very vocal about their negative image of policies to reopen schools in August or September of 2020. The policy image of teachers' unions is evidenced by threatened strikes in some larger cities such as Chicago if schools were reopened sooner than the union believed that they should be. As recent as February 2021, negotiations between teachers' unions in Chicago were continuing to be discussed to decide whether reopening schools would be acceptable. The community and parents of students with disabilities, as well as special education teachers, have expressed the policy image of concern for students falling further behind due to school shutdowns and virtual learning. Students with disabilities are unable to access education as general education students are, and that is also the case while learning virtually. Many of the policy images created during the COVID-19 pandemic and school shutdowns in early 2020 were created by what the media produced and disseminated, by public addresses by President Trump and his counterparts, and by the fear of the unknown. Policy venues are the institutional locations where authoritative decisions are made concerning given issues. Policy venues usually have a decision-making bias because the participants, the values, the concerns, and the decision-making process vary from one policy venue to another. Policy venues are those federal, state, and local leaders and groups who were part of the creation of policy changes. Federal mandates regarding shutdowns of businesses and schools led to state and consequentially local guidelines for schools. The biases of federal and state leaders played a major part in what policy proposals were made. The multiple streams framework is a tool that can be used to analyze the policy process using three streams: the problem stream, policy stream, and political stream. The problem stream recognizes that policy responds to some problem. In the case of this research, we are looking at policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and the way it changed education. Though some schools were becoming more technologically involved and using online platforms to teach and complete assignments, traditional ways of teaching and learning were still very prevalent in most schools. So schools were faced with the problem of needing more technology and one-to-one devices in order to be able to teach students. The policy stream refers to the generation of policy alternatives in policy communities. One of the actors in the policy stream is the United States Department of Education, who released guidelines for the restart of school during the pandemic and implementation of the IDEA for students who were learning virtually. Those guidelines were then taken by each state and developed further to specifically address each state and district. With the use of the U.S. Department's guidelines and Georgia Department of Education guidelines, each district and or local school board was able to decide on specific reopening procedures based on the level of infection and spread of COVID-19 within each particular community. The political stream is made up of three elements: the national mood, interest groups, and government. National mood is the assumption that most people within a community think along common lines, and their mood swings from time to time. Pew Research Center conducted a survey in July of 2020 asking adults whether they think K through 12 schools should reopen for in-person learning for the 2020-2021 school year. About 60% of those surveyed were more concerned about the risk for teachers and or students getting or spreading the virus, as opposed to 48% who were concerned about academic delays. The survey was conducted again in spring 2021, and the percentages had flipped, where 61% of those surveyed were more concerned with the delays, whereas only 45 to 48% were concerned with the risk to teachers and students. Interest group campaigns exhibited mainly through the opposition of reopening schools to in-person learning by teachers' unions. Governments and legislators make up the third element of the political stream. Communities of Georgia, with a primarily Democratic following, waited to reopen schools and begin the 2020-21 school year with a delayed and or only virtual learning. In contrast, communities with primarily Republican followings chose to reopen schools earlier and offer in-person learning. State and federal conservative leaders were encouraging schools to reopen for the 2021 school year as soon as possible to restore normalcy within the schools.